They called me forgetful when all I had done was ask for help opening a jar. I never imagined a simple request, spoken in a moment of fatigue and mild frustration, could become the spark that unleashed an entire narrative of suspicion and paternalism disguised as concern. But perhaps that is exactly what it was. A soft grenade lobbed into the center of my life, where everyone thought I'd weaken under the assumption of age. My hands, which once kneaded dough and fed generations of grandchildren, were only shaking slightly from arthritis, a trace of wear earned from 8 decades of work and love, not from any failing mind. 80 years old, I have lived here for more than half my life, watched my family grow around me in this house, whose walls have absorbed laughter and tears alike. And yet now I find myself under a different kind of scrutiny, one not born of affection, but of an unspoken belief that I have become less than I ever was. It is still the same morning air drifting through lace curtains, carrying the scent of wilted roses that my late husband planted 50 years ago, all the more poignant now that he is gone. I lie in bed for a moment longer, listening to the silence and the distant hum of a car pulling into the driveway, convinced that today will be like any other. Tea at 10, perhaps a crossword puzzle, a phone call with my daughter in another time. Zone, and then a quiet afternoon of familiar routines. Instead, I feel a cold presence settling into the room as the front door opens and the day outside begins without me even knowing it. That simple ask for help, this morning, the echo of it, has summoned more than assistance. It has awakened an entire apparatus of doubt aimed squarely at me. I am Eleanor, 80 years old, living in the same home I shared with my husband for 52 years, surrounded by the things we collected together, the books he loved, and I too loved. I weathered grief and loss with grace, yet this sense of being watched, measured, catalogued, labelled, it feels more invasive than any loneliness I have endured. It feels like my dignity has been stapled to a clipboard, waiting to be evaluated by someone who sees a woman and thinks weakness. I remember the weight of that jar in my hand, its metal lip stubborn and unyielding. I remember the slight wince as my arthritis twinged in protest. I remember sinking back into my chair and asking, politely and quietly, "Would you mind?" And for that moment, it seems, I became less capable, less autonomous, less me. There is a certain cruelty in this kind of erasure. It is not a dramatic act. No loud accusations, no broken heirlooms, no slamming doors. It is the quiet removal of agency, a shifting of responsibility that comes clothed in smiles and soft words. We just want to help. You don't have to do it yourself anymore. Let us take care of you. It is the replacement of familiarity with foreignness, as labels appear on pantry jars, spice racks rearranged, my favourite quilts swapped for sterile, easy clean throws. The room is the same, the pieces are the same. Only the meaning has changed, and I realise that the people who know me best are beginning to see me not as the woman who raised 5 children and ran a household with precision, not as the one who hosted Sunday brunches and remembered birthdays and anniversaries, but as a project to be managed, a condition to be monitored, a problem to be solved. I lie here in this room permeated by memories, listening to the muted footsteps of the woman who promised just to check in, who pops her head around the doorway and smiles. But there is a distance there, a kind of scanning that feels clinical, not caring. And I think I have lived. I have known loss and joy in equal measure. The weight of this jar was nothing compared to the weight of motherhood, marriage, the remains of my husband's coat that hangs in the closet even now, a touchstone to the woman I was for so long. The faint tremor in my hand is not confusion. It is life's echo. And yet, I lie here, feeling small under the gaze of a world that sees wrinkles and decides that stories are over, that independence is no longer safe, that a lifetime of earned wisdom can be overwritten with a piece of paper and a gentle but unmistakable nod from someone in a white coat. And so this morning, as the door closes behind them and I hold my tea a little tighter, I understand that something in me has shifted. I feel a tightening in my chest, a spark of clarity. I will not let a jar or a diagnosis or a form define me. I will not become invisible in my own life. I will speak, I will remember, I will name, I will refuse to slip into the margins. I am Eleanor, who still knows each spice in her rack, who can recall her grandchildren's birthdays without a second thought, who has kept every equation balanced in life's ledger. And I will make sure they remember me too. The next morning, I heard the doorbell before I even put on my slippers. It rang not with the casual rhythm of a neighbour dropping off mail or a friend with a casserole, but with a kind of official sharpness, the kind that carries paperwork and expectations. I wasn't expecting anyone, and certainly not so early. The clock read 8:13. I hadn't yet had my tea. I hadn't yet taken my thyroid pill or fed the cat, or opened the curtains that still held the shadows of night. I tied my robe tight and walked slowly to the door, already uneasy. Through the frosted glass, I saw a figure, neat and pressed, standing too still. Not the postman. Not anyone I recognized. When I opened the door, he smiled too quickly. He said my name, Eleanor Wem. Thatcher. Like a question, but one he already had the answer to. I nodded, cautious. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Dr. Miles Perot," he said, flipping a laminated ID badge toward my face for a brief second, too fast to read. "I'm a geriatric wellness liaison from your health provider network. I was asked to come by for a courtesy check-in." I blinked. "A what?" He smiled again, like a man who's practiced looking gentle. "Just a brief in-home assessment. No pressure, no cost. We do this with many clients your age, routine evaluations, just to ensure everything is on track for cognitive and physical support needs." I hadn't scheduled anything. I hadn't requested anything. I told him as much. He tilted his head sympathetically. "Of course. I completely understand. In these cases, we're usually contacted by a family member, just out of concern, you see. Happens all the time." There it was, tucked in that practiced tone. Concern. Concern so carefully weaponized it arrived on a clipboard. I asked him who had requested the visit, and he consulted his tablet with dramatic effort, as if he couldn't quite locate the information, but trusted I'd lose interest before pressing further. "Ah, yes. It seems your son and daughter-in-law, Henry and Carla Thatcher, initiated the request." "Just a basic check," they said. "Nothing urgent. They care very much about your well-being." He said that last line with a small nod, as if I should be grateful for their vigilance. I felt my stomach lurch, not from fear, but from the raw bitterness of knowing. The jar. The damned jar. I stepped aside and let him in, because I was too stunned to do anything else. Because when someone shows up in a pressed blazer with medical credentials and the blessing of your own blood behind them, you don't slam the door. You try to understand the rules of this new, uninvited game. He walked through my home like it was already half belonging to someone else. He made polite comments about the wallpaper, the smell of bread I had baked 2 days earlier. Then he sat in the armchair Derek used to fall asleep in and opened his leather folder with a slow, deliberate movement. It began innocuously enough. "How are you sleeping, Eleanor? Do you have any difficulty remembering names? Do you ever get lost in familiar places?" Each question carved a quiet notch in the wall between us, as if he were folding me into a file that had already been labelled. Before he arrived, I answered evenly at first. I've never had trouble remembering names. I sleep as well as anyone my age. No, I do not get lost between the kitchen and the hallway I helped design. But my answers didn't matter. I could tell. He was not here to listen. He was here to confirm a decision already made in whispers, in texts exchanged behind my back. I became less of a person with every stroke of his pen. He asked me to spell world backward. He asked me to name as many animals as I could in 60 seconds. He watched my hands as I poured tea for us both and made a note when I used 2 instead of 1. He smiled throughout it all, but I saw the small triumph in his eyes each time I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because I was confused by the intrusion itself. At one point, he asked if I'd experienced any falls recently. No, I said, unless you count the fall I took in trusting my own family. That one made him pause, just for a breath. Then the smile returned, and he said, "Let's talk about safety." He brought out brochures with cheerful fonts and pastel images, assisted living options, home alert systems, early-stage memory care plans. He slid one brochure toward me as if it were a gift. "This one's nearby," he said. "Lovely facility. Offers art classes and a garden." I stared at the image on the front, a silver-haired woman painting sunflowers with a plastic smock, and I felt something inside me retreat. This wasn't concern. This was control. This was a prelude to containment. I asked him plainly, "Do you think I need to be in a facility?" He answered too quickly. "Not at all. Not necessarily. But it's always good to think ahead, to have options, to know your family is ready to support your next steps." I felt my voice lower, steady. "What next steps?" He hesitated. "Well, aging can come with new needs. Your son and daughter-in-law simply want to ensure you're not alone in those moments." Alone. I wanted to laugh. I've been alone every Tuesday when Carla forgets our lunch dates. Alone every birthday that Henry can't seem to call before nightfall. Alone when I bring my own Tupperware to their holiday table because they never cook anything I can eat. As he packed up to leave, he handed me a sheet with a list of recommended next steps, including a follow-up neuropsychological evaluation. "Just protocol," he said. "You're clearly doing great. This is just to cover all bases." Then he paused. "One last thing. Do you mind if I take a quick look at your medications?" I told him I didn't mind. I walked him to the kitchen, opened the cabinet myself, let him see the tidy row of clearly labelled bottles: thyroid, blood pressure, multivitamins. No sedatives, no unmarked containers. Nothing out of place. He nodded, made a few final notes, then extended his hand with exaggerated warmth. "It's been a pleasure, Eleanor. You're sharp as a tack. Just keep us in the loop, okay?" When he left, I stood at the door long after it closed, watching the space where his car had been. I didn't cry. I didn't sit. I stood, quietly, breathing in the residue of that encounter, letting the anger bloom slowly in my chest. It wasn't the questions that insulted me. It was the assumption behind them, that I was fragile, that I could be managed. That one moment of need, one jar too tight, had opened the door to all of this. They'd been waiting, I realized, for the first chance to start the story they needed, that I was slipping, that I was softening around the edges, that they were right to plan my future for me. I walked to my desk. I opened my planner. I wrote down the date, the time, the doctor's name, and every question he asked. I made a file. I labeled it. They think I won't notice. Then I underlined it. Twice. It began subtly, like a draft under a door you didn't know was open. The next morning, I found labels on my spice jars. Neat, uniform, printed in that chirpy font they use for back-to-school supplies. Cumin, paprika, cinnamon. At first I thought it was a mistake, that perhaps my daughter-in-law Carla had meant well, had thought it helpful. But I hadn't asked her to touch anything in my kitchen. I hadn't invited her in, hadn't given her a key, and yet the labels were there, affixed with a precision that suggested time and intention. That same day, I opened my refrigerator to find the milk moved to the top shelf and my Tupperware meals neatly stacked in containers I didn't recognize. Someone had reorganized everything. I closed the fridge gently and stared at the door for a long moment, then walked through the house slowly, one room at a time, touching objects like a woman trying to remind herself that she still lived here. My chair by the window had a new cushion, not mine. A floral pattern I would never choose, already flattened in the middle, as if someone had sat there recently and often. The lamp I use for reading was angled differently. The thermostat was lower. In my bathroom, my toiletries had been rearranged, labelled again, with little sticky notes. AM, PM, as needed. The handwriting was Carla's. I know it, because she writes with a small circle over her E's. Always has. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't scream. That's not how I operate. But I did start keeping a list. A notebook with a hard green cover, one I'd used years ago for garden planning. Each time I found something moved, changed, reduced, I wrote it down. I called it the revisions. My world was being adjusted around me without my permission. The motion sensors came next. Small beige devices, like plastic eyes, perched in corners and above doorways. They're for your safety, Henry explained when I noticed them blinking. Just in case anything happens. They're discreet. I asked who installed them. Oh, a friend from work helped me out. Just a quick setup. Didn't want to bother you. Bother me? In my own home? He said it with that same smile I remembered from when he was 10 and had broken the porch light with a baseball. A practiced charm that assumed forgiveness. I didn't give him the satisfaction of anger. I simply said, noted, and walked into the kitchen where my favourite teacup had been replaced with one that had a rubber grip sleeve. The visits increased too. Not long ones, not warm ones, just drive-bys. Carla would stop by with a casserole, just to drop off, linger in the doorway, eyes darting over the counters, the floors, the mail pile. Henry would text in the evening, "You doing okay?" Not a call. Never a call. Just a message that let him check a box labelled "Concerned Son." And if I didn't reply within an hour, another one would come. "Everything all right?" Then, by the third hour, a phone call. Tense, almost scolding. "We were worried. Why don't you answer your phone?" As if silence were a diagnosis. My mail began arriving opened. The bank statements were no longer sealed. At first, I thought the envelopes had torn in transit, but the cuts were too clean, the folds too deliberate. One day, I found a printed copy of my utility bill left on the kitchen table, highlighted in yellow. Carla had circled the thermostat reading and written, "Maybe we can adjust this." I sat down, folded the paper in half, and placed it under my coffee mug without a word. It was the quiet that got louder, the way people at church started asking if I was keeping busy, the way the pharmacist double-checked my name before handing over my blood pressure medication. He'd never done that before. The way my neighbour, Martha, knocked on the door one afternoon with a Tupperware of soup and said, "I heard you might need a hand now and then." I asked, "From whom?" She blinked, flustered. "Oh, I just meant, sometimes it's nice not to cook every day." I thanked her, accepted the soup, and then sat on the porch staring at it for 20 minutes before feeding it to the crows. I began waking earlier, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I needed the house to be mine again, even if just for those hours before the world remembered I was elderly. I'd sit in the kitchen with my tea and my notebook and write down everything they'd touched. I made a separate column for tone of voice, documenting when Henry started using that careful cadence, slow and over-patient, like I was a child about to forget my own name. "Did you eat lunch yet, Mom? Let's write that down so you remember. Don't stress yourself with bills." The last one was my favourite. As if bills were a burden I hadn't carried for 40 years without their help. I who balanced household accounts before automatic payments existed. I who budgeted for birthdays, for braces, for burial plots. Now, I was gently being ushered into irrelevance. Then came the calendar. It appeared on the fridge one morning, a whiteboard, magnetic, with days of the week marked out and appointments scrawled in colour-coded ink. Carla had written in grocery delivery, garbage day, and weekly check-in with Dr. Lang. I had not scheduled that appointment. I hadn't even heard of Dr. Lang. When I called the number, the receptionist told me it was a preliminary consultation for geriatric case management. "Nothing formal," she said. "Just an intake. We work with families transitioning into supportive care." I cancelled it on the spot. At that moment, I understood fully. This wasn't care. It was a soft coup. Not a takeover in name, but in action. I was being managed like a spreadsheet, assessed like a leaky faucet. My identity rewritten, quietly, in the margins of checklists and calendars. And the worst part? They called it love. They said it was for my own good. So I started making my own list. Not of changes this time, but of what they hadn't noticed. I listed every item in the house they overlooked. The poem I wrote in college tucked behind the mirror. The cash envelope hidden inside the sewing box. The fact that I still remembered every PIN number I'd ever used. The name of the nurse who once cared for Derek in hospice, and how she wept when he passed. The last time Henry forgot my birthday. The time Carla borrowed my good blender and never returned it. The jar I asked her to open. The crack in her voice when I said, "Never mind. I'll do it." I added something new to the list every day, a way of reminding myself, I am still whole. I am not reduced by your suspicion. I am not erased by your organization. I am not made safer by your supervision. I am not your child. I am not your burden. I am Eleanor M. Thatcher. I raised you. I buried my husband. I paid off this house. I know what's happening. And I am writing it all down. It was the sound of the lid sealing that did it. One quiet twist, one soft click under my palm, and the whole house seemed to exhale with me. I had been holding that jar since morning. Not the same one from the week before, but its twin, heavy with preserved lemons I'd made last winter. The kind Derek used to eat straight from the jar with a fork, grinning like a boy. The rubber mat helped, yes, but it was my grip that broke the seal, my hand that pressed just right at the edge, my breath that held steady while I turned the lid against the resistance of glass and time. I didn't even want the lemons. I opened it just to see if I could. And when I did, I stood still in my kitchen, jar in one hand, the lid in the other, feeling not triumph, but a quiet return. like a voice I hadn't heard in years had called my name again. That evening, I set the jar in the center of the table. I poured myself a small glass of wine, the cheap kind they sell in cartons now, and sat with the jar between us like it was an old friend returned. The house was quiet, but something inside me had begun to shift, a kind of recognition that I didn't need to wait for someone to hand me back what had been mine all along. I wasn't going to convince Henry or Carla of anything. Their minds were made. Their narratives were already rehearsed, their glances loaded with soft scorn and disguised duty. But I wasn't going to argue with them either. No speeches, no tearful pleas, just action, slow and deliberate. I would change the story not by protesting it, but by stepping out of it. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not for anyone else, but for myself. A navy blouse, pressed slacks, a brooch Derek's sister once gave me that looked like a peony. I took my notebook and walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. It had been years since I'd used public transport, but the rhythm came back quickly. Coins, transfer slip, the low hiss of the doors. I didn't go far, just downtown. But that was enough. Enough to feel the city move around me, to hear conversations that had nothing to do with aging or appointments or safety. I bought a coffee from a vendor in the square, black and too hot, and sat on a bench where pigeons gathered like judgmental ants. I listened to the teenagers on their phones, the old man arguing with his crossword, the mother telling her child to stop climbing the railing. No one looked at me. No one asked if I needed help. I was just another person on a bench, and that, for the first time in weeks, felt like freedom. When I returned home, I cleaned the fridge. Not out of frustration, not to undo what Carla had done, but to reclaim it. I moved the milk back to the bottom shelf. I threw away the labelled containers I hadn't made. I found my favourite mustard hiding behind an oat milk I never bought and brought it to the front like an act of rebellion. Then I pulled out a pad of sticky notes and wrote one thing on it: my kitchen. I stuck it on the fridge. A quiet joke, but it made me smile. That night, I opened my drawer and took out the file labelled "They Think I Won't Notice." I reread every entry, the dates, the changes, the quotes. I could feel the paper warming under my hand, as if it too was tired of being ignored. I added a new page. Today, I opened the jar. Without help, without struggle, without anyone watching. It wasn't about the jar. It never was. Then I flipped to a fresh page and wrote a list of questions. Not questions for them. Questions for me. What do I want that I've been told I don't need? What do I miss that no one asks about? Where do I go when I disappear into myself? And the most important one, what do I still control? The list grew slowly over the next few days. I wrote in it each morning with my coffee, before Henry's inevitable text, before Carla's subtle inspections. I didn't respond to their messages immediately anymore. I let them wait. I wanted them to feel the quiet on their end, to wonder. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted to stretch the silence long enough for me to hear my own voice in it. One evening, I found an envelope buried at the back of a drawer, Derek's handwriting on the front. It was from years ago, a note he'd left me after a small argument, one I'd forgotten. Inside, a single sentence. You are the hardest person I've ever underestimated. I held that paper like it was breath, like it was proof, like it was permission to begin again. So I did, slowly, carefully, without announcement. I called the bank and removed Henry as a joint user on one of the smaller accounts. The clerk on the phone asked if I had permission. I said, I'm the account holder. She paused, then apologized. I said, "Don't. Just do it." She did. I found a local notary and made an appointment. I updated my will. Not because I was dying, because I was living. I baked bread for the first time in months. My hands remembered. My body remembered. I remembered. That week, when Carla came by with another container of soup and found the spice labels removed, she frowned. "Did something happen?" she asked, half laughing. I looked her in the eye and said, "Yes." I didn't explain. I didn't owe her an essay. She stood there for a moment, unsure how to proceed, then set the container on the counter. "Well, let me know if you need anything." "I will," I said. I didn't mean it. That night, I wrote one more note and taped it to the mirror in the hall. "You are not slipping. You are standing still while they blur the edges. Keep your shape." And I did. It began with the bank card, or rather the lack of it. I had gone to pick up a few groceries. Nothing extravagant, just flour, fresh eggs, and the good kind of butter, the one wrapped in foil that Derek used to say tasted like Europe. And when I got to the register, the young man behind the counter, who'd always called me Miss Eleanor, with a wink, scanned my items and waited patiently as I reached into my wallet and handed him my card. He ran it, then frowned, tried again. "It says it's been declined," he said, kindly, as if he were breaking bad news about the weather. I blinked, confused, and pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and found the account frozen, red letters blinking across the screen. "Temporarily suspended. Please contact customer support." I stood there in the narrow aisle with the smell of overripe peaches and vinegar in my nose, trying to steady my breath. I paid in cash, left the store with a fake smile plastered on my face, and called the bank as soon as I got home. It took 3 separate transfers before I reached someone who sounded older than 20. She read me a note on the account aloud. "Due to concern from a co-account holder regarding cognitive decline, this account has been paused pending review by designated legal representative." My mouth went dry. "And who exactly is that representative?" I asked. She gave me Henry's full name, my son. My son had flagged my account. My son had initiated what he called a precautionary hold on my own money. When I asked if they had any legal documentation authorizing such a step, the woman on the line hesitated. "He said paperwork was in process," she said. "He said you were in the early stages of—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I thanked her, calmly, and hung up the phone without letting my voice shake. Then I sat at the kitchen table for what must have been an hour, not moving, just watching the second hand on the clock as if it might offer a different kind of truth. Later that afternoon, Henry came by. No warning, no text. Just a quiet knock on the back door and his voice calling, "Mum?" Like he hadn't just undermined my autonomy behind closed doors. I opened the door slowly, let him in without a word, and he entered the kitchen with the nervous energy of someone trying to sell a bad idea. He sat, smiled, folded his hands like a schoolboy rehearsing a presentation, and began with, "I know you're going to be upset, but just hear me out." I didn't say anything. I let the silence settle, heavy and unkind. He continued. "We've been talking to a few professionals, just exploratory conversations. Nothing's final. It's just, we're trying to make sure things are in place in case something happens." I asked, "What's happened?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" I said, "You've frozen my account. You've brought doctors into my house. You've started rewriting my life without asking me. So tell me, What exactly has happened? He looked down, then back up, face folding into that soft paternal expression adult children wear when they think their parents are becoming something less than whole. You asked Carla to open a jar. Then you called the bank 3 times in 1 week, asking the same question about interest rates. It's little things, Mom. We just don't want anything to fall through the cracks. I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I said, I've asked you to call me before dropping by. You never do. I've asked Carla not to touch my pantry. She does it anyway. If there are cracks, Henry, it's because you and your wife are swinging hammers. He looked hurt, but not surprised. We just want what's best for you, he said. I replied, no. You want what's easiest for you. That night, I searched through my file drawer and found the number for the Senior Rights Advocacy Clinic I'd once bookmarked years ago when a neighbor told me about her brother being moved into a facility without consent. I had listened then with vague horror, never imagining I'd need the information myself. I called the next morning. The woman on the line, Erica, sounded like someone who didn't flinch easily. I told her everything. She listened carefully, asked for dates, names, documentation. I sent it all. The next day, she called back. You're not alone, she said. This happens more than you think. But you've done the right thing by documenting everything. We can take it from here. Meanwhile, the pressure didn't stop. Carla arrived with a stack of brochures tucked under her arm. Just ideas, she said brightly, laying them out on my coffee table like a game of solitaire. Retirement communities, cognitive wellness centers, co-housing options for independent seniors. I picked one up, flipped through it. A page showed a group of women laughing over a watercolor class, all of them wearing the same shade of lavender. I asked her, do you think I want to spend my days pretending to be less than I am? She said, don't be dramatic. It's not about that. It's about being proactive. I handed her the brochure. You can be proactive about your own life. Mine isn't yours to curate. That week, I received a letter. Thick, formal, with a return address from a law office I recognized. Inside, a notice of intent to initiate a capacity review. Legal language about guardianship, about concern from immediate family, about potential cognitive risk indicators. I read it once, then again, then slowly folded it and placed it on the desk beneath Derek's photograph. I stared at his face, his smile, the way his eyes always looked like he was about to crack a joke, and whispered, "You'd hate this." And he would have. He knew me, knew the difference between forgetfulness and violation, between real concern and convenient narrative. I called Erica. She said not to respond directly, that her team would handle it, that this was a playbook move, rattle the subject, then offer friendly solutions in the form of managed control, that most people folded under the pressure. I told her, "They don't know me." She laughed, not unkindly. "No," she said, "but they will." In the days that followed, I took back what I could. I had the locks changed. I notified the post office to hold my mail for pickup only. I removed Carla's number from my medical files. I visited my primary doctor in person and asked for a full cognitive assessment. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted it documented, on record, with a doctor who had known me for years. She ran the tests. I passed them all. At the end, she looked at me and said, "You're sharper than half my staff." I nodded. "Please make sure that's in the file." She smiled. Already done. When Henry texted me to ask if we could have a calm talk, I responded with a single sentence. From now on, speak to my legal representative. He didn't reply. But that weekend, I saw his car idle at the end of the street for 10 minutes, then pull away. And through it all, I felt something settle inside me. Not rage, not even sadness, but clarity. A line had been drawn. They thought they were preparing for decline. What they had prepared for, without realizing it, was my departure. Not a vanishing, but a severing. A decision. I wasn't going to fade. I was going to choose. And I already had. The decision wasn't dramatic, not in the way movies might show it. No slammed doors, no shouted ultimatums, no rain-drenched monologues on the front porch. But it was irreversible all the same, like a door gently closed that no longer opened from the other side. It came one morning, quiet and grey, with the sound of the kettle beginning to hum and the slow rhythm of rain tapping against the window pane. I had already dressed, not out of routine, but with purpose. Navy slacks, a collared blouse, the same pair of shoes I wore to Derek's hearing when the insurance company tried to underpay his hospice. I made coffee strong and black, and while it brewed, I laid out the documents I had prepared over the past 2 weeks. Notarized statements of capacity, letters from my doctor, the legal notice Erica's team had drafted asserting my full rights and protections under elder law statutes, and finally, a 1-page declaration, typed, printed, and signed in firm, unshaking ink, revoking all financial access Henry once held, and notifying him that any further contact under pretense of guardianship would be considered legal harassment. I placed everything into a manila envelope, sealed it with the same care one might use packing a fragile heirloom, and wrote, in my neatest script, his full name and address, with a postmark from my town, my home, still mine. I didn't mail it. I delivered it myself. There's something cleansing in walking down a street you've known for decades, in shoes that still fit, with shoulders square and back straight, carrying a message no one can interrupt. I didn't ring the bell when I arrived. I knocked, 4 sharp, clear taps that said, "You know exactly who this is." Carla opened the door. Her expression flickered through several phases: confusion, surprise, then the wary smile she wore like perfume, thin and artificial. "Eleanor," she said, "we weren't expecting—" I handed her the envelope before she could finish. "This is for Henry," I said. "It's been signed, notarized, and backed by legal counsel." She took it hesitantly, as if it might burn her fingers. "What is this?" I didn't answer that question. "Tell him he'll find everything he needs to stop pretending I'm not capable of running my own life." I turned to leave before she could respond. Walked back down the steps without haste, without drama, just the deliberate rhythm of someone who has remembered her name. When I returned home, I took a pair of kitchen scissors and opened the drawer that still held the extra copies of the assisted living brochures Carla had left behind. One by one, I cut each of them in half, not with rage, but with satisfaction, like trimming dead branches from a rosebush. Then I gathered the pieces and placed them in a paper bag, walked out to the fire pit in the backyard, and lit them. I watched the pages curl and blacken, the lavender-tinted stock paper giving way to ash, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed without weight, pressing on my ribs. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook, the revisions, as I had once titled it. But now, I turned to the final page and wrote, simply, "Closed." Then I took out a new notebook, crisp and unmarked, and on the first page, I wrote, "Things that belong only to me." The list began with the obvious: my house, my memories, my choices. but quickly grew stranger, sweeter. The smell of rain at 5 a.m., the feel of sun through lace curtains, the exact sound the mail slot makes when the yash post lands flat, the word Derek used to murmur when half asleep. Stay. The phone didn't ring that night, nor the next. And when it finally did, 2 days later, I let it go to voicemail. Henry's voice, tight and restrained, filled the room. I got your letter. We need to talk. I deleted it. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He didn't say, I understand. He said, we need to talk, as if negotiation were still an option, as if dignity was something to be bargained over tea. It wasn't. Not anymore. The final gesture came on a Monday morning when I walked into the same bank that had frozen my funds without my consent and sat across from the same young man who had once called me Ma'am with faint irritation. I smiled. I'd like to close the joint account. Permanently. He blinked. Is the co-holder aware? I slid the envelope across the desk with a copy of the legal revocation. He is now. I watched him scan it, watched his posture change, watched him realize this wasn't a formality, it was a statement. He processed the request, printed the final balance, and handed it to me. I folded the receipt neatly, placed it in my wallet, and stood. Would you like to keep the account open in your name? He asked. I smiled, soft but certain. Number. I'd like to start fresh. Outside, the air had that faint smell of ozone, the kind that always hinted at change. I walked past the cafe, nodded at the girl sweeping the steps, and continued on toward the park, not with an errand, but with intention. I found a bench, sat down, and simply listened, to wind, to laughter in the distance, to my own breath as it came steady and full. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't diminished. I wasn't declining. I was done being mistaken for someone waiting to be managed. I had made the choice. I had sealed the envelope. I had burned the evidence of their expectations. And now, I was still, whole, undeniable, myself. There is a silence now that no longer feels like exile. It's different from the silence that filled the house in the days after Derek died, or the muffled quiet of conversations paused as I entered a room, or the airless hush that followed each of Carla's well-meaning intrusions. This silence belongs to me. It is the kind that expands instead of shrinking, that wraps around my days like a shawl I chose for myself, soft and heavy and warm. I moved through my home with a calm that I had forgotten was possible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the shutters reminding me that this place, this life, is still mine, still responsive to my will, not theirs. The calendar on my refrigerator now bears no marker but one, a small note in my own handwriting that simply says, "You're still here." I read it each morning before I take my tea, before the world dares to remind me of its expectations. They haven't returned, not really. There have been messages, short, clipped, respectful in tone but hollow in content. Henry wrote an email 2 weeks after the letter was delivered, offering to rebuild communication on new terms. I read it once, closed the screen, and chose not to answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Carla sent a card, flowers on the front, blank inside but for one line. We meant well. I didn't return it. I didn't destroy it either. I tucked it in the drawer beside the old letters Derek used to write. Not because it deserved that place, but because I no longer need to explain the difference to anyone but myself. My days are simple. I rise early, walk around the garden, tend to the climbing roses with hands that still remember the rhythm of pruning, the quiet logic of growth. I speak to the neighbour's cat, who now visits my porch daily, as if she knows it is a safe place to be forgotten. I reread old books and write small reflections in the margins, little arguments with my younger self, sometimes reassurances, sometimes corrections. I no longer make lists of what's been taken. I make lists of what I've kept. My mind, my humour, my boundaries, my name. I even bought myself a new jar of preserved lemons. It sits unopened on the shelf, not as a challenge, not as proof of anything, but simply as a reminder that nothing has power over me unless I allow it. I've also begun speaking again, not to them, but to others. A woman at church, Miriam, told me over coffee that her daughter was asking strange questions about medication, whether she needed help paying bills, whether maybe it was time to consider the next phase. She laughed when she said it, but her fingers trembled slightly on the rim of her cup. I looked her in the eye and said, "Start writing things down. All of it. They'll call it concern, but what they mean is control." Her eyes widened and then softened. I thought maybe I was imagining it. I shook my head. "No, you're not. But you don't have to wait until they make it real." We didn't say much more. We didn't have to. It's strange how little it takes to feel seen. Just one person who says, "Yes, me too." And now, if I'm honest, I think I understand something I didn't before. Not just about Henry and Carla, or about this age we call old as if it's a curse, but about how easily a life can be rewritten without anyone noticing. It doesn't happen in a single act. It happens in edits, in polite suggestions, in slowly rearranged drawers, in doctor's visits you didn't schedule, in the erosion of choice masked as generosity. And then, if you're not careful, you start to repeat their story back to yourself. You forget that the jar was heavy, yes, but so are keys, and you still carry those. So this is what I want to say. If someone like me is listening, sitting alone at a window, wondering if she's next. You're not a project. You're not failing. You're not behind. You are not theirs to manage. If you forget a name, it doesn't mean your life belongs to someone else. If your hands tremble, it doesn't mean you don't remember strength. If you ask for help, it doesn't mean you've surrendered. But if they mistake your softness for surrender, correct them. Quietly, clearly, completely. You are still here. That is the beginning of everything.